She doesn't understand the implications of a government budget surplus. She thinks if the Labour government was able to persuade the private sector to do enough borrowing to drive the government budget temporarily back into surplus, like under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, they would be boasting about it. They'd be boasting about deleting dollars from private bank accounts and forcing households further into debt, creating a more fragile financial system, because she genuinely thinks that if the government has a budget surplus, that means it's got pounds stored up somewhere. She's stuck in that government as household narrative, which I sort of understand, because as I was saying before, I had the same training as her. I saw the world in much the same way she does. When I was actually training people who were working at the Bank of England, but I didn't understand the monetary system, and the people in the class knew it better than I did.
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. If this is your first time hearing about MMT, you might want to listen to our first 3 episodes for an introduction, which I've linked to in the show notes, along with some other things that relate to this particular episode. Just wanted to jump in here to let you know that I'm writing a show about economics. The working title is Christian Riley Tries to Be Slightly Funny About Economics, and I'm going to be performing it for the first time on Saturday, the 22nd of February, 2025 at the Leicester Comedy Festival. That's the Leicester in the UK. Sorry to friends in the other Leicesters of the world, namely those of the US, Canada, and the Cook Islands. I'm hoping to take the show to all of those Leicesters, but I thought I'd try it out at the Leicester in the UK first, rather than the one in Sierra Leone. The online listing isn't live at the time of recording, but if you're going to be in the area, save that date, 22nd of February 2025. I hope to see you there. In other news, the documentary film Finding the Money, which charts the rise of MMT and features Stephanie Kelton, Warren Mosler, L. Randall Wray, and other primary MMT developers, is now available for streaming in all regions of the world, and there'll be a link in the show notes for that, along with links to other things that you might find helpful for following the conversation in this particular episode. And as ever, there'll be a link to where you can support this podcast financially via patreon.com/MMT Podcast. And as I always say, supporting us in other ways, whether it's by recommending us to other people or just by listening and spreading the word about this stuff, really helps too. So thanks as ever for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive in. Welcome one and all to the MMT Podcast. I'm Christian Riley.
And I'm Patricia Pino.
And we are delighted, as we always are, to be joined today by economist, author, and founder of Modern Money Lab, Professor Stephen Hale. Thanks for joining us today, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Christian. Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure. So, Stephen, since we last spoke, we have a new government and a new Chancellor, Rachel Reeves. Unfortunately, our new government is continuing our old government's austerity posture, for instance, by not scrapping the 2-child benefit cap, which would lift 250,000 children out of poverty, and by cutting winter fuel allowance payments to pensioners. To justify these so-called tough choices, Keir Starmer, Rachel Reeves and party loyalists are citing the dreadful state of government finances that were bequeathed to them by the old government. So I was heartened to read this criticism of austerity from a former Bank of England economist. Quote, "While it is right to make reducing the deficit a priority, there is a clear choice in terms of how to achieve it. This government have chosen to pursue an approach that is damaging to growth, highly regressive and fundamentally unfair. They have cobbled together various justifications, the out-of-control spending of the last government, for example, but these arguments simply do not stack up. And because the justifications do not hold up to scrutiny, it has become increasingly clear that the underlying motivations are not economic, but are instead political and ideological. end quote. Now, that former Bank of England economist's name is Rachel Reeves. And that's how she felt when she was writing in 2010, when the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats were doing the austerity. But now it's her. So obviously things are different. Stephen, as an economist who used to train Bank of England staff, what do you think to Rachel Reeves' first premise that reducing the government deficit should be a priority right now?
Yes. Not only did I used to train Bank of England staff, but I did exactly the same course as Rachel a few years before she did at the London School of Economics. We both have a master's degree in economics from there. So I'm
her senior.
Well, all right. I'm just old, but I don't think it had changed all that much in between me doing the master's degree and her. You've discussed many times, Christian, on your podcast, the way in which mainstream economists mislead people and mislead themselves when it comes to thinking about fiscal policy, about the role of the government budget and what it means to aim to use austerity to reduce the size of the government's deficit over time. Labour governments always love to appear tough.
Appear being the key word. I hope it's just appear.
They get into power. They always say the same thing. I know the Conservatives say it as well, but they always say the last government lied about the state of the public finances. Spending is out of control.
They've got something to prove, don't they?
Well, they have. And they also, and this might apply to some of your listeners, they take people for granted. They just assume that people who lean towards the left will vote Labour, whatever Labour do. So they don't feel constrained when it comes to moving towards the right. And I don't think, inflation is falling in the UK at the moment. It's back within the Bank of England's target range. The government's deficit is certainly not out of control. If it was out of control, then it would be adding to inflationary pressures and causing the inflation rate to accelerate. So there's no economic justification for austerity at the moment in the UK. Why are they pivoting like this? Why? I don't know.
I'd like to kind of roll back a little bit at that word austerity, because I've seen a lot of comments online from people kind of arguing, and this argument comes up every time we say that a government is inflicting austerity, is that people say, oh, it's not really austerity. For example, the Tories didn't really do austerity because the deficit actually went up. Or Rachel Reeves is only imposing, these taxes because she intends to spend money, basically increase spending. Therefore, it's not austerity. Can we just have a definition of austerity? Is there a technical term for it? A definition for it, or is it simply a political stance or a political strategy? How would you define it?
I don't think there is a technical definition for it. It is a political strategy. They often, of course, when people discuss austerity, they're often talking about governments that are pursuing, at best, pointless and at worst, extremely ill-advised targets for as their forecast of the future fiscal balance is concerned, which, as we know, and as modern monetary theory reminds us, taken out of context, makes no sense at all. It doesn't make any sense to talk about a need to have a government budget deficit below 3% of GDP now or at any specific point in time in the future, because you don't know what the state of the economy is going to be. You don't know what the private sector is going to be doing in terms of its demand for net savings. You don't know what the external sector is going to be doing. Fiscal policy should be about pursuing the public good. First of all, you've got to decide what the public good is, what you're trying to achieve in the medium and long-term future. And then secondly, you need to look at what your spending plans are, given the structure of the tax system and the state of private balance sheets and the potential that any of your spending plans might be pushing the economy, or at least some part of the economy, beyond its productive capacity and putting upward pressure on the rate of inflation. If that's the case, then you need to address that issue, but you need to think about what the causes of inflation are, what the best way is of responding to those causes of inflation. If it's genuinely too much spending in the economy when the economy is full employment, putting upward pressure on the price level, then one of the ways you could react to that would be to look at freeing up resources by cutting public spending or by increasing taxes in order to reduce private spending in the economy. But that's not the only way of doing it. And often, generally, it's not the best way.
Just to answer your question, though, Patricia, there is a dictionary definition of austerity, and it's something like the condition of living without unnecessary things. That's an austere existence. But, when it comes to, the things we're talking about, the specifics here, like not scrapping a policy that would lift 250,000 kids out of poverty or taking away fuel payments for pensioners, I would argue that we've gone into this Trump era reverso world where austerity is now the condition of dying without necessary things, given the number of deaths that have been linked to the austerity drive that began in 2010. And the article I just quoted from, which is a piece called The Politics of the Deficit from Renewal magazine in 2010, in that article, Rachel Reeves kind of brags about the previous Labour government's record on fiscal responsibility. And she reminds the reader that when Labour came to power in 1997, the government deficit was 2.7% of national income, but then over the next 10 years, they managed to get it down to 0.3% by 2007, 2008. Now, I don't know if those dates sound familiar to anybody for any particular reason, but as long-time listeners will know, the government's deficit over a given period of time is equal to the non-government sector's surplus over that same period of time. So all things being equal, Stephen, what might be a predictable consequence of the government's deficit being reduced by 89%?
Well, the UK has had a current account deficit for a long time, a trade deficit, basically, for a long time. The rest of the world has wanted to acquire sterling assets. That deficit is not denominated in net terms in foreign currency, and certainly the UK government has no significant foreign currency denominated debt. So the rest of the world has been acquiring sterling assets. Now, we might see that as a good thing or a bad thing, but the accounting counterpart of that is that the UK as a whole has been running these trade deficits for years and years, and will do in the near future as well. So that means, as we know, in the monetary system, deficits and surpluses have to cancel out. The rest of the world, the foreign sector, always runs a surplus as far as the UK is concerned, or at least has for a long time. That means somebody in the UK has to be in deficit. If the government is not in deficit, or if the UK government's deficit is smaller than the UK's balance of payments deficit to the rest of the world, it means the private sector is in deficit. It means the private sector overall is going into debt or further into debt. Now, particularly that what was a problem before 2008 is that it was households that were doing a lot of that deficit spending, that were going into debt, and household debt relative to people's disposable incomes were rising over time. And given the same set of circumstances now, we would expect one of two things to happen if the government aims to run a surplus or to run much smaller fiscal deficits in the UK. Either the private sector won't deficit spend, in which case the economy will slow down and go into an unplanned recession, and then the government's tax receipts will be less than they anticipated, and the welfare spending will be more than they anticipated, despite the cap they have in place, and they'll end up with running a deficit anyway, but an unintended one and a bad one. Or the alternative is that, just as happened under the Blair government, the Blair-Brown government, when they deregulated finance, the UK ended up with an increasingly financialised and unstable monetary system, which went the same way as the US system when the GFC eventually struck. That will happen again, and Minskian financial instability will build up, and at some point then what you would expect to to happen is that somewhere in the financial system, and it may well be in the housing market, once again, there'll be an increase in insolvencies and collapsing asset prices and problems with banks. We could be back to that sort of problem all over again.
Just for anybody new here, the Minskian fragility building up is to do with economic units, households, people, their balance sheets moving into Ponzi territory. Am I right?
Yeah, people ending up with more and more debt relative to their income and relative to the value of the assets that they hold as well, and so being more susceptible to the risk of insolvency if there's a downturn in the economy and in the property market.
In this passage in the paper that Rachel Reeves wrote in 2010, she said, yeah, we got the government deficit down by 89%. And then, but obviously what's not said there is, which meant that there was lots more debt being loaded up onto private balance sheets. And the result is what happened in 2007, 2008.
And then they ended up with a deficit which was about the same size relative to GDP as Greece's deficit was. But it was just lucky that the UK was not in the single currency, was issued its own currency. So whereas interest rates on Greek government debt went through the roof, because Greece, of course, is not a currency issuer, interest rates in the UK went down towards zero after the GFC, and there was no problem at any stage in the UK government running a high enough deficit in order to rescue the banks initially, but in order to at least put a floor underneath the recession in the UK. Now, what worries me is that Rachel Reeves and her colleagues have learned nothing from the 1990s and the 2000s. They've just forgotten it.
I'm a bit more cynical than that. Stephen. I mean, she's justifying it by saying that, she got into office and she's realized that actually spending has been a lot worse than initially feared, that she's got some privileged information inside.
That's what George Osborne said, though, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's exactly what George Osborne said.
It's exactly what he said.
It's like the end of Animal Farm, isn't it?
Yeah. But somebody was pointing out that there is no new information once you get into government. I mean, all this information on spending is in the public realm. You can, why would she, what else would she have found out now that she couldn't have known before? So I'm a little bit cynical.
What's the problem with the spending? Is inflation going up at the moment? Is anyone forecasting in the near future a big increase in UK inflation? So why is she worried? The deficit at the moment is not adding to inflation. Of course, we can argue that they're creating a deficit for the wrong reasons. The deficit is benefiting the wrong people, or it's not government in its investments, is not investing in the right areas. But the scale of the UK government fiscal deficit at the moment is not a problem, and is not going to be a problem during the term of the current government.
In whose interest is her move? Who does it primarily benefit? The specific policies that she's enacting, because she's desperate to justify them, and I don't think she believes half the justification she's given. So who is actually pushing this?
I did want to flag up, I mean, to be fairer than I'd like to be to Rachel Reeves, she does bring up that distinction in this article between Greece and the UK in terms of currency sovereignty, and uses it as an argument to not do austerity. So we know that she knows that. But then I wanted to flag up also in that article, Rachel Reeves writes, the 2008-2009 recession was the worst in 60 years, and it was predicted by no one. Is that correct?
Well, that's not right, as we know. Wynne Godley, Randall Wray,
Steve
Keen, the list goes on. These people, other people in more informal settings like the Bill Mitchells, but the people I've just mentioned in published works.
Yeah, Dean Baker, Michael Hudson.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, absolutely. And the people that I mentioned, Wynne and Randy and Steve, they all had a sensible model explaining what was happening and predicting what was likely to happen. It's really not that complicated, of course, once you understand sectoral balances, is it? And once we understand that a government surplus is just deleting dollars from the private sector. So either it's going to drive the economy into recession if you're not running a trade surplus, or the private sector is going to go further into debt. And then, as Hyman Minsky used to point out, there's a point beyond which increasing the debt-to-income ratios in the private sector is liable to create a very fragile financial system, which inevitably at some stage will, if you're lucky, will lead to a recession that the big government and with the help of the big central bank can rescue. And if you're unlucky, you'll find it's the big one. It's a 1929 or 2008 moment. Now, I'm not saying we're going to go back to 2008, but I am saying that in the UK, as in New Zealand, which has a government pursuing a similar kind of strategy, it's just that the government in New Zealand is a very right-wing conservative government. It just sounds like the Labour government in the UK at the moment, with similar fiscal rules. In both countries, if they're not careful, their toughness on fiscal policy, and we still haven't really explored how they might justify that, is just going to drive the economy towards a recession and create unnecessary unemployment and leave important needs for people towards the bottom end of the income scale of society unmet.
Just switching to what Stephanie Kelton would call the deficits that do matter. Looking at the latest data from the Office for National Statistics here in the UK, last quarter's unemployment rate was 4.2%, so that's 1.435 million people, and underemployment was 7%, that's 2.292 million people, so 3.7 million people unemployed or underemployed. To an MMT economist, what would that suggest about the government's deficit?
Well, it suggests that the government's deficit is not high enough. How can Rachel Reeves justify her stance at the moment? And how does the government and the OBR and Paul Johnson and all those other people in the UK who are...
the austerity industrial complex.
Yeah, how do they justify it? What do they expect to happen if they don't cancel the winter fuel payment? What do they expect to happen if they... Well, you were talking about the two-child...
two-child benefit cap.
What do they expect to happen in the near future? And forget the distant future. You know, we can deal with problems as far as if there's excessive public spending in 10 years' time, we'll worry about it a bit nearer 10 years' time.
I think they're caught in the city. They are trying to get the city on their side. Because I don't know any kind of more passionate defender of these types of policies than the City of London. And I think that they've gone into the election knowing that they needed the votes from people who were traditionally left-wing or left-leaning, and therefore expected Labour to come in with an investment narrative. But they've gone into government without any intention of actually fulfilling that narrative. And actually, they've, politically, they need the approval, they need the support, both monetary and political, and, of the City of London, that actually it's quite embedded within the media as well. I think that's what's happening. I don't think she's thinking too much about what's going to happen to the UK economy.
Yeah, that's why I think it's useful to remind Rachel Reeves what she thought when somebody else was doing the austerity. Like the UK's budget deficit in 2010 when Reeves was arguing against austerity was 11%. And she notes that the estimate of the structural deficit at that point was 7.2%. Today, again, the latest ONS data estimates the deficit is 6%. So, even if we accept her view that in absolute terms, a lower deficit equals a healthier economy, which is wrong. But, today's fiscal position is healthier in those terms, even by that standard. So, if the so-called tough choices were unnecessary in 2010, they're even more unnecessary now.
So it makes no sense. Her arguments make absolutely no sense.
So just to cap this off, can the UK government afford to scrap the two-child benefit cap? And can the government afford to keep making winter fuel allowance payments to pensioners?
Well, in one sense, the government can afford absolutely anything. of course. Does it make sense to engage in these spending or welfare payments? Is it the most effective way of helping people out of poverty or keeping them out of poverty when they're vulnerable? There's a variety of approaches to doing this, but what's not acceptable is not to have an approach. I mean, you don't need a winter fuel payment if there is nobody that's not going to be able to afford to meet the necessities of life and pay for their winter fuel.
But she's not making those alternative arrangements, is she?
No. So we know she's not going to run out of pounds. We know it's not a problem with. We know there's no problem with funding UK government spending. We know at the moment inflation in the UK is forecast by everybody to remain low in the relatively near future. That's not a major short-term risk. So what is she concerned about? Why is she doing this now? She wants to do everything she can possibly do to reduce the fiscal deficit. Why does she want to reduce non-government saving? What's the reason for that?
Yeah, I think part of it is what Patricia is talking about, which we'll get onto later, which is appeasement of the city, I guess.
And Tory donors, really, isn't it? She's trying to win over Tory donors in order to keep the Tory party out of government, because that's Tory kryptonite. You take away their donors, they have no mass appeal. I think that's what she's trying to do.
I wonder how effective it is, though. I think Tory donors, if they see the Tories losing, I don't think they're going to go, oh, yeah, let's suddenly switch horses and back the party that's nominally for Labour. I think they're going to go, let's give more money to the Conservatives if they're losing.
It is distressing they can still get away with this.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
Just on the nature and origins of money, in a recent article for The Conversation, you wrote, if we accept that money and markets did not emerge naturally but had to be created by governmental institutions and legal systems, this means that there is no such thing as a genuinely free market, no such thing as a natural rate of unemployment, and no such thing as a natural distribution of income and wealth. So, of course, we all agree on that. But why would a skeptic who happens to be listening to this accept our core proposition that money and markets had to have been created by government institutions and legal systems?
Because the story that everybody has been told, if they've done economics at school or if they've done a first-year course at uni, almost anywhere, at any point over the last 50 years, about the emergence of money is demonstrably wrong. Everybody knows it's wrong, or at least everybody that knows anything about the archaeology or anthropology of money knows it's wrong. It is not the case that anywhere in the world, systems of barter, markets in which people traded in order to obtain the basic necessities of life, where in order to reduce transaction costs, people started to use some commodity like gold or silver as a convenient means of exchange and convenient way of pricing other items, reducing, as I just said, reducing transaction costs, allowing for economic development where that commodity became the first form of money, and then later on was for convenience incorporated into coins, and then governments came along and took over the issuance of coins, and then later on we got paper money and all that. That's the story that we've all been told at some point in our education, that markets predated money and money was invented by the private sector in markets where governments played no role at all. And we know that's a complete myth. It is not something that there's any doubt about. It's just a complete myth. It might make some sort of logical sense to people, but as far as we can tell, it's never happened, not anywhere in the world, even once. We know that for markets to exist, there has to be a legal framework. You have to have property rights. There have to be political authorities. There have to be law. There has to be law. And as far as we can tell, money was invented 5,000 years ago, or a bit more than 5,000 years ago, in the Iraqi desert, when people were living for the first time in larger communities than before. which were ruled by political, religious authorities, which had armies and administrators working within them and had to provision those armies and administrators, so had to force people to make tributes, or what we might call taxes, to them. And we know that the first money was the unit of account in which those taxes were assessed. And we know that quite quickly, financial contracts in that unit of account were drawn up on clay tablets. And we know that those clay tablets were the first form of fiat money, or money with no intrinsic value, so that money with no intrinsic value goes right the way back to the very beginnings of organized economies and monetary systems. We know that money had to exist before markets could develop, because in order to make your tax payments to the authority, you either had to have that which was necessary to pay taxes. Well, you had to have that which was necessary to pay taxes. So you either had to provide goods and services to the governmental authority, or you had to trade with other people to obtain what you needed to pay your taxes. And we know we've had similar stories down through the millennia since. We know that most of the time across monetary history, currencies, what most people regard as money, have not had intrinsic value. So we talked about clay tablets in the movie, Finding the Money. Randy Ray talks about Hazelwood tally sticks in medieval Europe. Matt Forstater talks about paper money in
I think it was China was the first place to do paper money, I think.
Absolutely, yeah. But he talks about it in the context of the US colonies. We know how the British Empire introduced its currency in its African colonies in the late 19th century. You impose a hut tax, which is payable using coins with Queen Victoria's head on. You threaten to demolish people's huts and put them in prison unless they pay these taxes. They can't pay these taxes unless they can get these coins with Queen Victoria's head on. So they either have to come and work for you and growing food for you, or constructing roads, or doing other work for the political authority, or they have to trade with people that are doing that to get that which is necessary to pay taxes. That's how you introduce a currency, and that's basically the story for the original development of money. So money came first before markets. A legal system, a tax system led to the creation of market economies 5,000 years ago, or 150 years ago, or at different points in time in different places around the world in between. Of course, that's an incomplete story and it's oversimplistic, but there is a lot more truth to that story than the conventional story. And it reminds us currencies and markets were developed by governmental institutions. They didn't emerge naturally in the absence of such institutions, and they couldn't have done. So it doesn't make sense to talk about a free market which the government doesn't interfere in. It doesn't make sense to talk about anything in the economy, whether we're talking about interest rates or whether we're talking about unemployment, having some sort of natural rate which is not influenced by or determined by political authorities or central banks, if we're talking about interest rates. It's all based on a myth, on the wrong story about the emergence of money.
I always say complaining about money being politicized is like complaining about water being wet.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's still the case. In the very first class, I mean, if you did study economics in school, the first week, they still talk about that old story of money. And it's wrong. It's just brainwashing because we know it's wrong.
The thing that most upsets mainstream economists, or maybe not the economists, but mainstream advocates, is that idea that the market is a consequence of a government or a central power trying to source itself with labor, or the market is a consequence of the currency as opposed to the other way around, because it threatens that quasi-religious belief on a kind of free market this theoretical free market that if only the government didn't interfere, then the market would work perfectly and the outcomes would be perfect and there would be no unemployment and all this stuff. And they adhere to that with a lot of fervor.
Well, it all goes back to Walrasian general equilibrium. 150 years ago, the original version of that model had no money in it at all. And even when we talk about modern day dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, beloved of treasuries and central bankers and neoclassical academics around the world, well, these days they include something in those models that they call money. But actually, the solution of the models doesn't require money. They are pure barter models. All general equilibrium models are pure barter models. Prior to the global financial crisis, so they have learned something, it was actually common to exclude money entirely from these models, or they'd have money as a numeraire, as a unit of account, but they wouldn't have a nominally safe asset in the model. There'd be no currency as an asset within the model. It's impossible to include realistic money and realistic monetary institutions in these models. And it's in these models that we get concepts like full employment or the natural rate of unemployment or non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, potential GDP. Even when you talk about structural deficits, basically that term relates to the concept of potential GDP and there being a natural rate of unemployment. It's all an artifact of a mythical general equilibrium model.
Which is apolitical, is an apolitical model, right?
Well, they think it's an apolitical model.
You didn't put enough irony in your voice there, Patricia.
Well, no, they genuinely do. They genuinely do think they're being scientific.
Yeah, in theory, it's apolitical. I mean, I think they like this idea of kind of anchoring their model on I'm doing inverted commas, in nature, because otherwise they have to admit that we're at the mercies of somebody's political whim, and they don't like that.
Just turning the corner and maybe getting back to what you flagged up earlier, Patricia, when we understand how monetary operations work for a government that issues its own floating exchange rate, non-convertible currency, we know that that government can always choose a policy to guarantee that that government's deficit will always rise or fall to a level that would permanently bring about non-inflationary true full employment, namely the MMT job guarantee. It's been called other things in the past, employer of last resort, and we've got episodes about that, which I'll link to in the show notes, or maybe we'll talk about it later on. If we instituted that today, that would lift people currently in poverty out of poverty. You know, it would be an unequivocal benefit to human beings. So let's say there's somebody listening who gets everything we've been talking about so far, and they agree with us that the government should let the deficit float in a way which would be commensurate with non-inflationary full employment and price stability. And they know the government can afford to do that. There's nothing standing in the way operationally. But then they think about Liz Truss, and then they worry. And the story they're working with is that Liz Truss proposed expanding the deficit through tax cuts. And the mere proposal was enough to make markets react, to make the currency depreciate, to make bond yields shoot up. And as we all know, Liz Truss's premiership was more short-lived than the shelf life of a lettuce. What's your take on the Liz Truss debacle? And what would you say to somebody who worries, who gets what we're saying here, but they worry that financial markets would punish any government that doesn't self-impose some kind of fiscal straitjacket to appease the city?
If the government organises itself properly, they can't really punish the government as far as yields on bonds are concerned. Anything the government does, anything that happens in the economy, potentially, if you have a floating exchange rate, can put some degree of temporary downward pressure on the external value of the currency. But as far as Liz Truss is concerned, of course, her proposals were for tax cuts primarily benefiting the already extremely well-off that we would be extremely averse to or opposed to. But if she had coordinated what she was doing with the governor of the Bank of England, she would have been able to do it. Under the Bank of England Act, if there is an argument between the Prime Minister and the Governor of the Bank of England, not that a British Prime Minister would want to take advantage of this, but if you have parliamentary support, the Prime Minister wins. The Governor of the Bank of England doesn't. That's actually in the Bank of England Act. We have a similar framework in Australia, by the way, which the current Labour government is trying to fling away, and at the moment is being prevented from doing so. In other words, being prevented from getting rid of the power of the government to overrule the central bank by the Australian Greens. But in the UK, the government still has that power. But they really messed it up. There was no consultation, as far as I can tell, with the Bank of England. They then introduced their mini budget where the temporary Chancellor of the Exchequer had tipped off his mates who were bond traders before the budget. I'm not saying he did anything, strictly speaking, illegal, but that is...
I think there's a clip you can find out there on the internet of Kwasi Kwarteng being interviewed while he and Liz Truss were campaigning for the premiership of the Conservative Party. And Kwasi, in response to an interviewer's question, says, "I think it's time we had a look at this at the Bank of England's mandate." Maybe that sealed his doom right there.
The Bank of England had just started doing quantitative tightening just before the budget. Quantitative tightening meant the Bank of England making net sales of treasury bonds from its portfolio, which would put some upward pressure on bond yields in the first place. So this is how badly coordinated it was. Then, of course, they announced the budget, and the bond traders were betting on yields increasing and trading in order to force bond yields up. Now, normally, yields on government bonds, when the central bank is not actively trading on the second-hand market, reflect market participants' expectations about what the average value of the bank rate, the official overnight interest rate, will be between now and when the bonds mature in, depending 5, 10, 15, 20 years, whichever bonds we're talking about. So when there is an expectation that there might be an increase in the Bank of England's perception of expected inflation, which might trigger a higher cash rate for a while than otherwise would have been the case, that puts upward pressure on bond yields. But of course, traders get excited too. So when they see bond yields start rising, which is the same thing as bond prices falling, then they double down on their bets, which tends to push things further in that direction. Now, what happened at the time, of course, without going into the boring detail, is that some pension funds in the UK had entered into bets on the interest rate derivatives market, which meant that rising bond yields would start to give them trading losses and would force them, because of margin requirements, to sell more bonds that they owned, adding to the downward pressure on bond prices and the increase in yields. The Bank of England put an immediate stop to that by stopping quantitative tightening and saying it was prepared to buy treasury bonds temporarily in order to stabilise the bond market. And the bond market was stabilised. As we know, when central banks want to set the interest rates on government bonds, they can. They simply have to trade on the secondary market in order to do that. And usually, actually, if there's upward pressure on bond yields, if the central bank wants to stop that actually happening, the central bank just has to say it's prepared to buy treasury bonds in order to prevent that happening. And then it doesn't actually have to buy those bonds or have to buy very many of them. In any case, everybody knows the Bank of England has got infinite pockets. So if it wants to trade on the bond market, it can set bond yields wherever it wants them to be, just as the Bank of Japan has across the last decade as far as Japanese bond yields are concerned. But the governor of the Bank of England then decided, quite right, that he'd had enough of Liz Truss. So he said that was a temporary measure and they were going to stop again once pension funds had got their balance sheets sorted out. That was a political move. However, had Liz Truss had the support and confidence of her own backbenchers, if she had wanted to, she could, with parliamentary support, have simply instructed the Bank of England about what to do. Maybe she didn't understand that. Maybe she was ill-advised. But actually, I think a lot of it is a sort of Truss-Corbyn effect, if we might put it that way, in that just as Jeremy Corbyn never had the support of Labour backbenchers, Liz Truss never had the support of Conservative backbenchers. They never wanted her to be the Prime Minister in the first place, and she wouldn't have been able to pass such a measure through Parliament, which she would have needed to do in order to provide instructions to the Bank of England. She didn't have the support. More fundamentally, of course, as we know, the government doesn't actually have to issue Treasury bonds in the first place if it doesn't want to. The bond market is not in a position to tell a monetary sovereign government like the British government that only issues financial liabilities in the currency that it issues, that doesn't need to borrow its own currency in the first place, what to do. However, it is the case that if currency traders decide they want to sell the pound, then the pound can depreciate. And if the pound depreciates, that's bad news for some people, good news for others. It can put upward pressure on the domestic price level. It hurts you if you're an importer. On the other hand, if you're an exporter, it gives you a competitive edge. So there are some people that gain, there are some that lose. When the exchange rate changes, it does redistribute income within the domestic economy.
It's never understood like that here, though. Like it's always universally considered an ill.
I'm really old, so I can remember when I was a student at LSE and Britain was an oil exporter and North Sea oil prices went through the roof and unemployment more than trebled, that what was a problem at the time was an appreciating currency, not a depreciating one. If the exchange rate moves too quickly over a short period of time, it can cause problems economically. However, there are, as far as I know, no examples of a high-income economy with sophisticated financial markets like the UK that has pursued a full employment policy that's ever seen its currency crash. Not a monetary sovereign. So, yes, there would have been, if Liz Truss had gone ahead with what she was planning to do, and if she'd forced the Bank of England to stabilise the yield on Treasury bonds, as they could have done, they wouldn't have had to do very much, actually, to bring that about. The bond market on its own cannot tell the UK government what to do if the UK government has the support, willing or otherwise, of its central bank. But there could have been further downward pressure on the pound, and the government would have had to ride that out. In a booming economy, actually, what tends to happen is then funds come back into domestic financial markets and the currency recovers again. So I don't think that would have been a crisis. On the other hand, I thoroughly despise everything Liz Truss stands for. I was very much opposed to those tax cuts, and I'm glad she lost her job.
We'll be right back after this message from our sponsor. Hey there, dear listener. Our sponsor for this episode of the MMT podcast is you, the listener, and we can't do it without you. And when I say it, I mean our aim to promote the best understanding that we can put together of how this thing called the economy actually works and how we can make it better. And we think a big part of that is knowing that better is possible and that many destructive policy choices are often sold to us by falsely equating the spending capacity of a government to that of a household. The way your government spends is nothing like the way a person or a household spends, because currency issuing governments are the source of their own spending money. Unemployment, underemployment, underfunded public health services, poverty, and many other things that politicians and pundits sell to us as sad but necessary are actually never necessary. Our money system has been mischaracterized in the media and academia for decades. An electorate that knows how it works can truly change things for the better and literally save lives. So we hope you can find it in your heart to support us via patreon.com/MMT podcast, because it really helps keep the show going and we want to make it bigger and better. So thanks as ever for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive back in. While we're on the bond market, I'll just mention to listeners, you and I, Stephen, did a 2-part interview about what bonds are and what these terms like yield and price mean and how they're related and how it works. So I'm going to link to those in the show notes. And also I'm going to link to the brief that you wrote with David Joy, another one of the fantastic Modern Money Lab lecturers, on the case for doing away with bond issuance.
Or at least understanding what we're doing. You don't have to do away with it as long as people understand what Treasury bonds are issued for in the first place, which is covered for anyone who's had the opportunity to see the movie very well in the movie Finding the Money. So I thoroughly recommend seeing that film. I've seen it about 40 times by now. If anyone has the chance of doing so in the foreseeable future.
The BBC recently told its readers that the government generally spends more than it raises in tax, which is true. But then they go on to say, to fill this gap, the government borrows money, to which you tweeted, no, it does not. Bond issuance is not about borrowing pounds. Briefly, what is bond issuance about?
Well, when the government spends, every pound that the government spends is a new pound in the British monetary system. Every official measure of the money supply goes up by £1 every time the national government, the UK's national government, spends a pound. So government spending increases the supply of pounds to the private sector. National taxes reduce the supply of pounds. They simply delete pounds from people's bank accounts and private bank reserve accounts at the Bank of England as well. If the government spends more pounds into the system than it taxes out of the system, of course, that's a net deposit of pounds in the British monetary system, and it increases the reserve accounts that the private banks have at the Bank of England. Now, before the GFC, so this is a long time ago now, before 2008, the Bank of England used to keep private banks deliberately short of reserves, short of electronic cash in their reserve accounts. And this was without going into the detail of how it all worked, but basically this allowed the Bank of England, by just feeding little bits of cash into a private bank reserve accounts every day. It was how the Bank of England in those days used to manage its official interest rate, the overnight interest rate. After the GFC, when they did all that quantitative easing, when the Bank of England expanded its balance sheet by buying a lot of government bonds and putting a lot of cash into bank reserve accounts, they no longer were keeping the banks short of reserves. But in the days when they were keeping the banks short of reserves, the government spending more than it taxed, put additional reserves into bank reserve accounts, and then the government would auction treasury bonds to match its deficit spending in order to drain those reserves again, in order to help the Bank of England manage the official interest rate, control the official interest rate under the pre-2008 system. Since 2008, that justification, draining reserves from the banking system, no longer exists. So why do you issue treasury bonds now? You issue treasury bonds to provide fund managers, including pension fund managers, with a safe asset that pays a good rate of interest for them to make investments in. And you also might issue treasury bonds because the interest rate on treasury bonds, what we call the yield on treasury bonds, provides a benchmark for financial markets. If you want to know the default risk-free 10-year interest rate in the UK, you look at the current interest rate or yield on 10-year treasury bonds. So it's important to issue treasury bonds because they play an important role in financial markets. They give fund managers something safe to invest in.
They adjust relative prices based on that, right? Of all other assets are priced in relation to the risk-free asset.
Yeah, and these assets, they also play a role on financial markets. They're used as collateral for loans and for bets on derivatives markets. So they do play a role, But you notice I haven't said the government needs to sell these treasury bonds to borrow its own currency, because it doesn't. And that's certainly in the last 50 years, that's not been a function that the issuance of treasury bonds by the UK government has done. The UK government does not need to borrow pounds from the private sector. It issues pounds. That's not one of those functions. It would be better, as Stephanie Kelton and Scott Fulwiler have recently been discussing, it would be better to fulfill these functions to have the Bank of England issue financial assets, because nobody thinks the Bank of England can run out of pounds. Nobody thinks the Bank of England has to run its finances like a household does. So nobody would panic if there were lots of Bank of England bonds that fund managers were holding, or that were being issued by the Bank of England in order to set risk-free interest rates on 5, 10 or 15-year financial assets. So I think it would make a lot of sense not to have bonds issued by the Treasury any longer. It's a very long time since Britain was on the gold standard. There is no earthly reason why the Treasury needs to issue Treasury bonds. However, there are some functions where we might want to issue things like Treasury bonds, and it would probably be better to have the Bank of England do that, because people would not misunderstand so much then. People would not think there was any default risk associated with them. People wouldn't think the government was going to be unable to react to another crisis like another pandemic. People wouldn't think the government was going to become insolvent. We could get past all that nonsense and have an adult discussion about how the government ought to draw up its budget, what it ought to be trying to achieve in its budgeting.
Just turning the corner, we've hopefully addressed some of the ideological resistance to this wacky idea of government spending to benefit its citizens. Now, that might involve some economic growth, and we know we can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. What would you say the degrowth advocate's position is on degrowing in a way that doesn't throw people who are already struggling even further under the bus?
Well, the degrowth, a little bit like MMT, really. If you asked me to define MMT, not that I'm going to, but even though he invented MMT, I probably wouldn't define it the same way Warren does, Warren Mosler. There'd be slight differences there. And so if you talk to two people about degrowth, you're not going to get precisely the same definition of degrowth. To me, there is going to be degrowth, because degrowth, to me, involves us moving back within our planetary boundaries. It involves...
Sooner or later, we'll be forced to do that, right?
Yes. Degrowth is not about gross domestic product necessarily. Gross domestic product is an accounting aggregate. We already have some things which do not involve money changing hands, which are included in GDP. In the UK gross domestic product, there's a big item which is supposed to reflect what people who own their own homes would have to pay in rent if they rented them rather than owning them. That's included in GDP. So you could redefine gross domestic product and include housework in gross domestic product, and it would increase hugely. GDP would increase hugely, but it's only an accounting figure. It's not what degrowth is about. Degrowth is about having a reduced ecological impact on the planet on which we live. And it is certainly the case that on a finite planet, we cannot see our ecological impact getting bigger and bigger and bigger. It is still the case that our global emissions of carbon dioxide, methane and nitrous oxide are rising each year. Hopefully that will peak this year or the next, but it hasn't peaked quite yet. Last year was the record level of emissions in the world that there has ever been. And of course, what we have to do is we have to see emissions, at least in net terms, fall quite rapidly towards zero. We don't just have to, we can't all start breaking out the champagne if next year or the year after somebody says global emissions have fallen. Well, great, but that's just a tiny a tiny start on the way. But it's not just about emissions either. Our rate of extinctions is said by people who know about these things to be between 100 and 1,000 times what's sustainable. And we are losing millions of species around the world. 70% of mammalian wildlife that was on the planet when I was born is no longer on the planet. This is not sustainable. This will not continue to happen indefinitely. It will come back, and perhaps it already is coming back to bite us. The amount of materials of different types that we dig up from the planet continues to grow every year, hasn't peaked, and actually has continued to rise. And here you can talk about a GDP more or less in line with gross domestic product in the last 20 years. At a global level, as far as material footprint is concerned, we don't even have relative decoupling yet. Now, we can't dig up more and more stuff, getting rid of more and more forests, taking more and more First Nations people off their land, denying more and more living space to wildlife. These things are going to change. They're either going to change because we plan to have a smaller impact on the planet in the future, and we reorganize our economies and we reorganize the way we provision for ourselves, and we do this in a way which is consistent with whatever happens to GDP, what we might regard as genuine progress in people's well-being in the decades to come. Or we'll be going down the limits to growth story that Donella Meadows told 50 years ago, very presciently, and later this century or early the following century, there'll be a collapse. So degrowth is going to happen. Degrowth scholars talk about planned degrowth. They talk about providing everybody with economic security, with a guaranteed minimum income, with a job guarantee, the right to participate in social provisioning in a way which maintains and restores our natural environment rather than continuing to destroy it. They talk a lot about radically lower levels of inequality. They often talk about maximum incomes as well as minimum incomes. They talk about universal, affordable, high quality public services, and they discuss areas of economic activity which are pointless or harmful and which they argue we ought to be reducing in scale or in some cases phasing out. Now, I'm not an expert on degrowth, but at least a couple of our lecturers are, one of whom, Colin Schneider, just a few days ago, did a public talk for Modern Money Lab on degrowth and modern monetary theory, which you can find on the Modern Money Lab YouTube channel. And I recommend people to watch, because Colleen has some very interesting ideas, as does her sometimes co-author Jason Hickel, whose book Less is More is also well worth reading, and the second edition of which, I'm assured, is going to be much more modern monetary theory consistent, because Jason has learned and thoroughly understood MMT since he wrote the first edition of that best-selling book.
That's great to hear. Where MMT meets the green agenda or the degrowth agenda, just to remind listeners about what happens when leaders are able to mislead the public about how money works, you don't have to look any further than the timeline of Labour. This is them in opposition. And they ditched their £28 billion green investment pledge. And the timeline is, September 2021, Rachel Reeves pledges to become the UK's first green chancellor and invest £28 billion a year for the rest of the decade in front of a cheering audience at a Labour Party conference in Brighton. Cut to 2024, February 2024, Labour says it now won't be able to meet the £28 billion a year green commitment, blaming the Conservatives for crashing the economy and maxing out, quote unquote, the country's credit card. On this fallacy, That's that's our least favorite metaphor, isn't it? And there's some stiff competition, right? On this fallacy of a nation like ours having anything like a credit card. Can a legally instituted currency issuing economic entity like our consolidated government even save up its own currency in some kind of an account?
That you're talking about sovereign wealth funds now. We have one in Australia. They're completely nonsensical, of course. In the case of Norway, they've built up a sovereign wealth fund over time now, to the extent that the government makes investments in foreign assets around the world. Then I suppose you're buying yourself the right to, as a country, consume goods and services produced in other countries in the future by making use of that foreign currency. But basically, that's a form of colonialism, really. It's a modern form of colonialism, building up investments around the world so that we can have people in other countries produce more stuff when they wouldn't choose to. For us, yeah. But in terms of the government saving its own currency, that's nonsensical. Of course it's nonsensical. It's ridiculous. In Australia, we have a future fund where it actually says in the rules of the fund that they prefer the fund managers, wherever possible, to concentrate on Australian rather than foreign assets. Now, if that was a way for the government to make real investments, which were going to be consistent with improving people's well-being in the future while transitioning to a sustainable economy, then, good. But it's not. It's just more financialisation. It's involved the government. It's often been associated with privatisation in order to help notionally fund the investments, as though the government was going to run out of its own currency or couldn't find its own currency to do whatever it wanted to do. They've just invested across the stock exchange, put upward pressure on share prices and put dollars into financial institutions, pursuing a pointless strategy which is based on the old government as household fallacy and the notion that the government, like everybody else, needs to build up its savings for the future, otherwise it will run out of its own currency. This is so dangerous because, of course, the problem with, in the case of Australia's fund, it's supposed to be about paying for the government's pension liabilities in the decades to come with an ageing population. The issue when it comes to looking after an ageing population is, are we going to have enough care facilities? Are we going to have enough carers? Are we going to have enough of all the things that elderly people need to consume? Are we going to have a good enough health system in the future?
All these things get cut back on to justify having enough money to spend on in the future.
Absolutely. Meanwhile, the government thinks that having notional funds in an account because it's bought shares in mining companies is going to be helpful. Of course it isn't. If you don't have doctors and nurses and medical facilities and decent places where people can live out their lives when they need to be looked after, if they're simply not available for people, but you don't have the people, you don't have the real assets, then you're not going to be able to provide those services anyway. You won't be able to pay for them because they won't exist. So every country should have a government by now which is doing an audit about what we can forecast, and they do this, but they just do it for the wrong reason. We can forecast what the demographic structure is going to be in the future. We can forecast goods and services people are going to need within our ecological constraints. And we then need to be thinking about, right, how many people do we need to train? What facilities do we need to construct? What investments do we need to make? There's one way I'm a bit different to most degrowthers, including my dear friend Colleen, is that I don't think we can build a post-growth well-being economy without eating into our remaining ecological budget first. So I think before there can be a degrowth and then a sustainable, what you might call steady state in terms of our ecological impact, we do need to dig more stuff up. Because we need to transition our energy system. We need to have an excellent public transport system before we can persuade people to use private cars, less. We need to make all sorts of investments in the infrastructure of a post-growth economy where the emphasis is no longer on growing real GDP, it's on improving the quality of people's life. And actually, it's this as much as anything else which has led me to have a ridiculous life in the last 2 or 3 years, putting together this master's degree that we now have and that, Christian, you're studying on, because we are stuck still with a narrative around the world that money, as far as governments are concerned, is in scarce supply, but natural resources and the planet are infinite. We can draw an infinite amount of resources from the planet. We can stick an infinite amount of waste into the planet. Most of the time, even when they make lip service as far as sustainability is concerned, but most of the time, that is what governs the political narrative and the way governments make their decisions and frame their budgets, the way it's discussed generally in the community. And all that needs changing. And again, to go back to the Finding the Money movie, I really love the emphasis that the director, Maren Poitras, placed on the need for, call it a Green New Deal if you like, call it a just transition, but a transition to a future which is about trying to ensure that everybody has the wherewithal to have a decent quality of life and economic security, not just in high-income countries, but globally, but in a stable and still friendly, if that's the right word, climate and natural environment. That's what the problem is. We just haven't, despite all the COPs and despite everything politicians say, including Rachel Reeves, about green investments, we haven't got our heads around these issues yet. And we're running out of time.
Just to cap off the issue of the Future Fund in Australia.
Yeah.
Yeah, our version, I came across an opinion piece from the FT, sort of weighing up different styles of sovereign wealth funds. Quote, while Australia's Future Fund was founded on privatisation receipts and a myriad of resource-rich nations have built their sovereign wealth funds from oil revenues, Britain has little choice but to fund the National Wealth Fund with debt issuance. End quote.
I feel like, I'm not going to use a rude word, round objects. That is complete.
Yeah.
I mean, that's so nonsensical, you hardly know where to begin. The British government does not really borrow pounds, certainly doesn't need to borrow pounds. A future fund is completely pointless, will achieve nothing at all. It just diverts people from thinking about things that actually matter. We haven't made as much progress as I'd like in Australia, but you've made even less progress in the UK in terms of having a grown-up discussion about fiscal policy and about planning for the future. And it distresses me. It distresses me that Rachel Reeves, she'll have no idea about MMT. She's probably never heard of Warren. She might well have heard of Stephanie, but she hasn't read The Deficit Myth. Well, she would have heard of Wynne Godley because he was once a government advisor back in the last century. But she's never seen a sectoral balances diagram.
Or if she has, she's forgotten it because, hey, nobody predicted the financial crisis.
Yeah, well, she doesn't understand the implications of a government budget surplus. She thinks if the Labour government was able to persuade the private sector to do enough borrowing to drive the government budget temporarily back into surplus, like under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, they would be boasting about it all over the place. They'd be boasting about deleting dollars from private bank accounts and forcing households further into debt, creating a more fragile financial system, because she genuinely thinks that if the government has a budget surplus, that means it's got pounds stored up somewhere, or at least an ability to borrow, which it doesn't think it had. She doesn't think it has before. She's stuck in that government as household narrative. There's so much that we don't have a chance to unpack here when we've been talking for so long already that underlies this, which I sort of understand because, as I was saying before, I had the same training as her. And until about 20 years ago, I saw the world in much the same way she does. I can't believe that I I had such limited competence when I was actually training people who were working at the Bank of England, but I didn't understand the monetary system, and the people in the class knew it better than I did. She doesn't understand the system. Some of it is cynical, like we were saying before, but some of it is because she's gone through that training. She's gone through the neoclassical training. You have this model where at the end of time, there is an assumption that the government basically has to pay off all of its debt. It's called the transversality condition in general equilibrium models.
At the end of the world, the government pays its debt. That's what happens.
As a consequence of that, by the way, if people don't want to understand all these models but just want to plough through them, you can go on to you can have a look at central bank models that the Bank of England or other central banks like to explain, and they hardly mention the government at all in these models. And when they do, it's simply about whether, in their view, fiscal policy is, in inverted commas, sustainable or not. Sustainability there has nothing to do with ecological sustainability. It's the notion that forecasting in what is a nonsensical model in the first place into the indefinite future, are they forecasting that the ratio of so-called government debt to gross domestic product will continually rise or not?
They consider government debt to be a Ponzi scheme.
Yes, whereas it's private. They get everything the wrong way round.
Patricia, you recently wrote on Twitter, "It must be tough being a lefty economist keen to fight for workers' interests and bring capital to heel, but also be forced to ask capital for the cash to do it, and do it politely enough so that it doesn't crash the economy."
Because I genuinely think that there are good-natured, lefty politicians or lefty economists out there who genuinely believe that they have that conundrum, and that's the kind of the key conundrum of their practice. How do I destroy capital while also being woefully dependent on it? And that's the trick. That's the restraint on them, and they're not willing to free themselves from that contradiction.
Absolutely right. And I've met quite a few such people, not just in the Labour Party either, but in the Greens as well. Molly Scott Cato is a very nice Greens politician in England and Wales who I did a talk with in 2018 in Oxford, where Larry Sanders was there as well. And we went to the pub before the talk, and she was asking me about a few things about MMT, so I explained. And she turned around to me just before we started talking and said, "So what you're saying basically is that all the economists and politicians are stupid." I don't think that's a very sensible thing to say. So I'm not saying that at all. And we're not. And I wish modern monetary theory advocates on social media wouldn't say that. It's not because these people are stupid. It's quite complicated. If you've been through a neoclassical training, then it is really difficult to free yourself. Keynes wrote something about this in the General Theory. He said it's not the new ideas that are the problem, it's escaping from the old ones, which have been thoroughly inculcated in us for decades. It is really difficult for Rachel Reeves. And when these people talk about things like issuing green bonds, they genuinely think that's a good idea.
The Green Party recently was talking about, in their conference, one of their key points, talking points, was that, if only we taxed the rich 1%, then we could fund all these things that Rachel Reeves says we don't have any money for. It's sad for me to believe that that's the kind of the radical stance at the moment. The most radical stance in politics out there in UK politics is let's tax the rich 1%.
In the defense of the Green Party or anybody that advocates for this, I think we're all in agreement. Hey, tax the rich.
From an ecological perspective, it makes a lot of sense because the rich consume a disproportionate amount of ecological resources.
But 1%.
Absolutely. That is nonsensical. So what can I do about that? Not very much, except for one of Christian's fellow students, who I won't name here, who is on our course, I believe to be a future leader of the England and Wales Greens. And I think she is going to have a thorough understanding of our approach to thinking about economics. And I know we don't have time to wait for these things to happen. But we're just going to have to do the best that we can to get as many people to understand modern monetary theory and other important elements in what you might call heterodox or non-neoclassical economics. First of all, because we've got a long-term vision about how to promote change, but also, secondly, because we're about 5 years from global climate panic. And at some point, I think before very many years have gone by, a lot of people are going to have their preconceptions or things they hold dear challenged. Some of them are going to be prepared to think again, and people are going to be looking around for ideas, and we have to be ready when that happens.
Yeah.
Yes, and to use a completely inappropriate metaphor for that, it's about the tinder lying around.
Yes, absolutely.
To round off, Stephen, to that end, in 2022, you wrote a piece for an Australian audience entitled, "This Budget, Amid Talk of Deficits, Consider the Lessons We Ought to Have Learned." So just translating that for a UK audience, we've got a budget coming up and we've got talk of deficits again. It's 2 years later. We should be 2 years wiser. What should we have learned by now about deficits?
Deficits are normal. I shouldn't use this word perhaps, but sort of almost natural, you might say. In the UK, given your relationship with the rest of the world, it is not possible for the British government to run budget surpluses. The economy will just implode eventually if you do that. There's no problem with the government running a deficit. We perhaps shouldn't even call it a deficit at all. It's a private sector surplus. It just involves the government making a deposit of pounds in the UK monetary system. The national debt is not a debt in a meaningful sense of the term either. It's nothing to worry about. It's simply the sum total of past occasions when the government has spent more into the system than they've taxed out of the system. It's not a debt for the taxpayers in the future. It's actually providing the safe financial asset for the citizens of the UK today. So don't worry about the government's debt. It's not really a debt. It's your net financial assets. And don't worry about the British government running a deficit. They can run a deficit. It could be too high and inflationary, but that isn't the case at the moment. The government can net spend in the interests of the private sector to create a well-being economy in the future. And indeed, whether they do that intentionally or not, across the lifetimes of the people listening to this podcast, the UK government budget will nearly always be in deficit. That's where you expect it to be. That's where it should be.
And of course, if anybody listening wants to learn about and really understand these things in depth, in a really supportive setting with the best teachers in the world, where can they go?
Well, there's only one global online course in the world, a master's degree, graduate diploma, graduate certificate, which covers both modern monetary theory and ecological economics. And that is the one which we run at Modern Money Lab in partnership with Torrens University. And you could Google for Modern Money Lab and have a look at our page. Or if he doesn't mind me saying this, you could even ask Christian about the course, because Christian is midway through doing it.
Absolutely. We've been speaking to Professor Stephen Hale, founder of Modern Money Lab, which is the place to go if you want to take your understanding of MMT, real-world economics, and ecological economics to the next level. They run online graduate and postgraduate courses taught by the best lecturers in the world in their respective fields, including Professor Stephen Hale, and also John T. Harvey, Eric Dean, Dirk Entz, Scott Fulweiler, Colin Schneider, David Joy, and many more. There are 3 intakes a year. The term start dates are generally mid-February, early June, and mid-September. But I'll link to more about Modern Money Lab in the show notes, where, as ever, for our Patreon subscribers, there'll be a link to all of our patron-only episodes. Lots of extras there for you to unlock. But for now, thanks so much for joining us today on the MMT podcast, Professor Stephen Hale.
Thank you, Patricia and Christian.
That was the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon, starting at $1 a month, and get access to patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino, and you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope to hear from you. Let me start that sentence again.